When Houston police opened the fridge, they didn't expect to find two human heads staring back at them. The house was quiet. No signs of forced entry. Dinner still on the table. But inside that refrigerator, neatly stacked, were parts of a husband and wife, dismembered and cleaned like leftovers. Their son was missing. What happened inside that home on Father's Day weekend of 1965 would become one of the most disturbing and unsolved cases in Texas history, the Icebox Murders. And the deeper investigators looked into the life of the man who vanished, the more they realized maybe the monster never left Houston at all. They call it the Icebox Murders. What follows is what the investigators wrote in their reports. It's what the neighbors told reporters years later when they still couldn't explain it. It's what remains cold in police files, even now. This is the story of Fred and Edwina Rogers. The story of a family home. The story of a disappearance. And the story of a gap where answers should be. This was Houston in 1965, a city of oil, of heat, of neighborhoods that were still small enough that faces were recognized and secrets didn't always stay hidden. Fred and Edwina Rogers lived in a modest house in the Sharpstown area, a place typical of the era. Tidy yards, curtains, a mailbox, polite waves in the morning. Fred Rogers, 57, worked at a local manufacturing plant. He kept the kind of hours that make a man known by name at the corner store. Edwina, 55, was the sort of neighbor who baked for potlucks and remembered birthdays. Their son, Charles, called Chuck by those who knew him, was 27. He'd been in the oil business, had a reputation for being intelligent, for being troubled in ways neighbors only hinted at. On the night of June 8, 1965, something broke the ordinary. What followed is a story told by police interviews, by coroner notes, by the thin, clinical prose of official records. It is a story of disappearance and of discovery, and of a household that vanished into suspicion. The first sign was small and strange. A phone call that never came. Neighbors later told investigators that the Rogers home was quiet that morning. Mail accumulated in the box. The family station wagon sat in the driveway. But no one had seen Edwina on her morning errands. No one had seen Fred leave for work. By afternoon, friends and co-workers noticed they couldn't reach the family by phone. Fred didn't show at the plant. When concern grows into action, it looks like this. Neighbors calling the police, asking someone to check the house. Someone else tries the back door and finds it locked from the inside. The front windows are drawn. There is a note in the files that speaks 1,000 small human words. Neighbors smelled nothing. No signs of forced entry. Police responded. They made the normal checks, yards, garage, utility access. The house yielded only the ordinary to their first cursory glance. Curtains, furniture, a cigarette still in an ashtray, a dinner plate stacked in the sink. It looked untouched, as if a family had simply stepped out and never returned. But then the officers found the house phone. It had been disconnected. That small fact was picked at like a thread. Phone service disruption in those days was a sensory red flag for investigators. In the mid-1960s, a disconnected phone was not uncommon. But when paired with a family that had not been seen and a locked house, it was the first real reason to suspect something else. 2 officers forced entry. The house surrendered its secrets slowly, in the clinical terms later repeated in reports. The living room was normal. The bedroom doors were closed. The kitchen held modest evidence of a life lived. But in the utility area, the place where the refrigerator sat, the officers found something that made them call for backup and the coroner. The original reports are written without flourish, as if to remove emotion from the facts. They describe human remains stored inside a refrigerator. This is where careful language matters. The coroner's office would later document the nature of the remains in clinical terms, discussing identification, estimated time of death, and signs indicating how long the bodies had been exposed to elements. Those reports would go on to map a timeline, blood pattern analysis, and other forensic markers, precise measurements and observations that are the foundation of every criminal investigation. Local law enforcement sealed the scene. The neighborhood, which had been quiet all day, suddenly filled with police cars, detectives, and reporters. The Rogers house was no longer a tidy suburban home. It was a crime scene. Word spread fast. When the news reached the plant where Fred worked, co-workers were incredulous. When neighbors saw the police activity, they whispered the same question. Where was Chuck, the son? The police files would show was the primary person of interest within hours. Charles C. Rogers, 27, known to some as Charlie, was an intelligent man with a complicated record. He had been fired from one job, had been seen arguing with his parents in the weeks prior, and, perhaps most importantly in the eyes of investigators, was not to be found. There were witnesses who put Charles nearby in the days before the discovery. A gas station attendant would later tell police that a young man matching Charles's description had bought a pair of pliers and a roll of heavy tape. A mechanic claimed Charles had come by asking for help on his father's car. A neighbor swore she'd seen him carrying a heavy object late in the evening a few days earlier. None of these witness statements prove guilt. They are, however, the sort of small, consistent threads investigators use to build a timeline. Detectives worked the phone logs, the last known interactions. They looked into Charles's recent movements, his bank records, his acquaintances. They interviewed girlfriend-type figures, men who had socialized with him, co-workers, distant relatives. As they dug, a portrait emerged in the reports. A man who'd been under financial stress, someone who'd had angry arguments with his parents over money and possessions, someone with a tendency toward eccentric behavior and paranoia, according to a few interviewees. By the second day, the case was national news. Reporters relished the headline, "Bodies Found in Refrigerator." What circulated in the papers was the shape of a nightmare. Parents, missing son. A suburban home turned into a vault of mystery. The sensationalism of the headlines bled into the public's perception, and the police had to move fast to keep facts distinct from rumor. They issued an all-points bulletin for Charles. He was reported missing, and at the same time, some detectives treated him as a suspect. The simultaneous statuses reflect a procedural tension in many missing person-turned-murder cases. A missing person can be both victim and perpetrator on paper. Meanwhile, technicians cataloged the scene. The coroner's team described their work in clinical terms that would later be quoted by historians. Samples taken for analysis, items cataloged and tagged, photographs taken from multiple angles. These images, now part of cold case files, would later help future investigators reconstruct the nights and hours before the discovery. One of the most chilling things in these early reports is the lack of a clear motive recorded in any immediate way. The family did not appear to be targeted for robbery. Items of value were found where they should be, and money in the house did not appear missing. There was little sign of forced entry, which suggested that whoever was responsible had accessed the home with permission or that the family had let their assailant in. The son's disappearance made a plausible scenario, a domestic dispute that escalated tragically. But that was not the only theory the police held. They looked at outsiders, at rivalries, at potential debt relationships, at business associates. Investigators checked records for known offenders in the area, cross-checked vehicles reported in the neighborhood, and sifted through the son's social circle for anyone with motive and means. As the days stretched on, the spotlight on Charles intensified. He was seen by several witnesses on the day after the bodies were discovered. 2 witnesses, then more, driving alone in his father's station wagon in the neighboring county. A clerk at a small motel reported that a man matching his description had stayed a night and then checked out early. Credit card receipts, gas receipts, all of these were small puzzle pieces. If Charles had fled, where had he gone and how? The hunt for Charles turned into one of the Midwest's most exhaustive manhunts of the time. Landfills were searched, train yards were checked, airfields and bus terminals were canvassed. Investigators ran his name through fingerprint databases. The family's records and the son's contacts were combed for any sign of a plan to leave town. Then came the break that every intense investigation hopes for. A sighting allegedly placing Charles in the company of a known associate, driving toward Oklahoma. Officers followed the lead and tracked a vehicle to a remote stretch of highway. But when they arrived, they found only a burned-out car, a smoldering shell with little to identify it and no sign of Charles. Burned vehicles muddy evidence and raise new questions. Was the fire a cover? Was it staged to mislead? Or was it a random act that happened to be connected by proximity? These details are what investigators call opportunities for misdirection. In cases where the suspect may be mobile and proficient under pressure, burned cars, changed license plates, and false identities are tactics that slow the trail and stretch the lead time for law enforcement. As time went on, some of the witness statements that initially placed Charles in certain locales were questioned. Memory is a loose thing. In the glare of national headlines, some people misremember. That is a point the police were careful about. They had to sift genuine intelligence from the noise of an anxious public. The coroner's report became the backbone of the prosecution's hoped-for case. In it, forensic specialists summarized what they could say unequivocally: identification of the victims, the estimated time frame of death, and circumstantial physical evidence that tied the scene to those last hours before the morning the house was entered. Forensic pathology in the 1960s was not the same instrument it is today. DNA analysis did not exist in common usage. Detective work relied on fingerprints, blood pattern analysis, witness statements, and painstaking interviews. Even without modern genetic tools, the coroner's observations established important facts for investigators. One of the knotty matters in the file was the precise timing. Establishing a time of death is essential to corroborate or contradict suspect timelines. Witnesses had placed Charles at various points during the 48 hours before the house was examined. If the coroner's time range matched witness sightings, that tightened the net. If not, investigators were left with inconsistencies. The media continued to spin the story in the public imagination. Some columnists pushed speculation into cheap narrative: a son with an axe of revenge, a cold calculation of inheritance, a jealous lover, a business dispute. These narratives, while sensational, forced detectives to double down on fact-gathering. The police made arrests on the basis of evidence, not headlines, and they followed procedures meant to stand up in court. They also had to contend with the son's legal status. Remember, he was both missing and a suspect. Law enforcement's initial posture was to find him alive for questioning. The question that gnawed at them and the country was simple and brutal. Had the son fled because he was terrified, because he had done something unthinkable, or because he feared being framed? Months turned into years. The case had the exact ingredients that make a crime linger in public memory: a seemingly ordinary family, a son with motive, a crime scene that felt intimate and invasive, and an unsatisfying absence of a definitive legal conclusion. The immediate thrill of the chase faded into the cold components of a long investigation. Paperwork, interviews revisited, old tips reevaluated in new light. In time, Charles Rogers became exactly what many suspects become in prolonged cases: a shadow. He had not been captured. He had not turned himself in. Some reports suggested he had last been seen heading toward Mexico. Others claimed sightings in small southern towns. Men sometimes disappeared in the sweep of the 1960s, changing jobs, leaving relationships, starting new lives in other states. But for detectives working the case file, a person can also be a vector for a great deal of assumption. A man missing becomes a suspect, and a suspect turns into a story that people want to close. What about the human cost? The Rogers case was a wound in a neighborhood. Friends said Fred and Edwina were kind, that their small acts of daily life made them memorable. The coroner's report is cold and efficient, but between its lines are the human elements that never make it to headlines. Funerals with empty chairs, children across town who knew the Rogers as the couple who gave them Halloween candy, and a small community that had to answer the question, how could this happen next to us? And then there is the son. Whatever he did or didn't do, he disappeared into a life we do not know. If he was guilty, he walked away. If he was innocent, then someone else walked away with a crime on their conscience and the lives of two people taken. Both scenarios break the neat boxes people want to put real wrongdoing into. There are small tangents that will always be part of the public's curiosity. Rumors that Charles assumed new identities. Stories that he dropped off the grid to Mexico. Unverified accounts that he was seen before he became a man with a number on a missing persons list. None of these tangents have become law. None have become conviction. They are the trailing threads that make true crime an especially dark type of lore. Decades later, the Rogers case lingers in the records as an unsolved chapter. Cold case units occasionally re-review the file. Advances in forensics have solved cases long considered impossible, and some families get answers that were once believed unreachable. The Rogers case is archived. Evidence remains in boxes. Photographs, interviews, and lab results sit like a time capsule. If a new lead had emerged that could be tied, with today's technology, to a living suspect or to preserve DNA, investigators could reopen that door. For the viewer, the lesson is not only about crime. It's a lesson about the limits of evidence in a world before the molecular revolution in forensics. It's a reminder that the ordinary lives, the ones we walk past every day, may contain fragility that has no precedent and no obvious cause. If the story of Fred and Edwina stayed with you, if the silence of unanswered questions pressed into you like a heat wave, then don't let their names disappear again. Subscribe now, not for noise, but to keep memory alive. Hit subscribe and be the kind of person who remembers. Because sometimes the only thing between a forgotten family and justice is a person who refuses to forget. Subscribe and stay with us. We'll keep asking the questions others won't.